Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next panel. I'm very happy to present to you Value Prop, Inclusive and Impactful Employer Branding. I have three amazing panelists speaking on this topic shortly, but just want to talk a little bit about what the conversation is and why we're having it. So employer branding for many has sat under marketing, it is sat under HR, it is sat under comms, because it kind of interweaves the three kind of functions into one talent. So employer branding is everything externally facing that is representative of your culture, your workplace experience, how you navigate talent. And naturally, employer branding today also interweaves with DEI and the conversation that I just had in the sessions with DEI leaders around the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And growingly, we're seeing candidates, as they're experiencing the interview process within companies, look at employer branding and look to see how inclusion is tying into that. So some of the things we're going to talk to today is how these leaders are working on refining their own employer branding within their organization, how they make sure that their employer branding is resonating with diverse talent and is showing inclusion, and how they're aiming, given the current national discourse, to amplify diverse voices and perspectives in their employer branding. So we have Stephanie from Twilio, Kathy from L'Oreal, and Latoya from Mastercard. Very excited to have you all with us. And so I guess to start, and we'll start with Stephanie on this one, what is the responsibility of someone who works in employer branding for those who maybe don't know? And what all goes into kind of your day-to-day as it relates to being an employer branding representative?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for kind of setting that up. And you did that pretty nicely because, again, employer branding, it's marketing, but it's, coupled with HR, talent acquisition, branding, corporate comms, and it's all kind of working together to tell that story of what does it mean to work at your company with the ultimate goal of attracting top talent. And particularly when you think about the fact that you spend a third of your life at work, and when people are job searching, they're looking for information to help them find the right job at the right company. Again, and making sure that they're using their talents and getting compensated. Like when you think about the gravity of it, like it's actually really super important. And in terms of the responsibilities, I think there are kind of two key things. I think one is, as you think about your employer brand, it's really telling the truth and being authentic. So really when you think about your employer value proposition, it's how do you authentically tell the story of the unique benefits of working at your companies and the challenges as well, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to attract the right candidate to the right role at the right company. And the goal of employer branding isn't to attract everyone. It's kind of like dating. It's to find the right match, if you will. And so in kind of telling the truth and being authentic, I think that's a great way to really kind of stake your claim about this is who we are and this is who we value. And then it's making sure that you're attracting the right talent. And then I think number two, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, but for employer brand professionals, I think we play a role in creating the type of culture that attracts talent. And so as a result, diversity and inclusion is super important to me. It's woven into everything I do, from, the kind of content and making sure we're featuring diverse voices to the sort of events that we host. It's really just woven into everything that we do, because at the end of the day, to be able to really tell a story of what it means to work at your company and to be proud to promote it, you have to really have an inclusive culture. And so for me, I think just truth in advertising is key. And then I think really creating a culture that people generally want to work at is, are some of the two big responsibilities I see for employer branding professionals.
Absolutely. Latoya, you obviously work at Mastercard, which I think everyone listening in is familiar with as a consumer. So I'm curious for you specifically, what's the importance of employer branding at Mastercard, considering that brand recognition is already, you can check that box pretty much at Mastercard. So what goes into the story of working and being an employee of Mastercard specifically for you, and how have recent events, particularly COVID, Black Lives Matter, and the conversation happening around racial inequality, and systemic racism. How is that impacting the way you approach employer branding at Mastercard?
Absolutely. I think one of the interesting things you said is everyone knows Mastercard. The unique challenge we have is that people think of Mastercard as a card in your wallet. And so we're really a payments technology company, and a lot of our employer brand heavy lifting is around really pushing out that narrative. So you can come to Mastercard and be a software engineer. You can come to Mastercard and work on our UX team. You know, there are all these different parts of the business that are not connected to the card in your wallet. We don't issue cards. Please stop asking me. I can't change your APR. We're not a bank. But so that's just one piece I had to get out there about kind of our employer brand. And particularly right now, I think two things. So one is the social justice movement. You know, one of the things that our CEO speaks about a lot is our decency quotient. And essentially, it really just means, you know, human decency. It is my hand on your back. It's not my hand in your face. And it's one of our values as a company. So we really couldn't say that we were a company that really stood for decency if we didn't allow our employees to speak freely. So we made sure that we've done that over the last few weeks. We've had a lot of open conversations. We really encouraged our employees to speak externally as well. We also had the day off for Juneteenth, and I had the pleasure of kind of writing the article to give the history, to open myself to ask questions. I did a lot of live tweeting that day also. So we're really empowering our employees and sharing the mic, for lack of a better word, to make sure that they have their voices heard. We do a lot of cultivating of content as employer brand professionals. You know, some of us work with agencies. We try to find headlines and themes. And I think right now as Mastercard, we're really seeing the importance in taking a step back as an employer brand and giving our employees the mic. So that's one piece. The other, just around COVID, is, you know, my role has jumped around a little. So first was in HR, so I kind of laughed when you said that, and then we went to communications. And consistent communication is key. We've done that, you know, quite often. We had town halls just around COVID. We've continued to really do things to have culture celebrated. So our BRGs are a big part of that. You know, there are Zoom DJ parties. There are virtual yoga events that are happening. So it's kind of a mix of giving our employees a voice and ensuring that they know that, like I said before, we have our hand on their back. So. Yep,
absolutely. That's great. Yeah. L'Oreal is similar, Kathy. If you notice my hair and how it's not the same as my headshot, that's because I dyed it with L'Oreal products during this break. I also did this cut all by myself, so props to me, who's never going to a hairdresser again. But no, L'Oreal is known by many as a consumer goods product as well. So curious how you kind of take that knowledge of what L'Oreal does, or kind of the perception of what L'Oreal does, because L'Oreal does much more than just hair products, and how you amplify that into an employer branding story, and how do you look at that that story holistically, from we're not just the people that are in your homes, we're also the people that you want to work for.
Yeah, you know, it's a very interesting time to be working with a consumer product company and a consumer goods company that actually owns over 35 different brands. So, you know, it's also a challenge when you have your parent company have the same name or similar name to one of your flagship brands. So we own L'Oreal Paris, which is a distinct brand, has a distinct audience, brings a distinct set of products to market. And then we have our company and our company brand, which shares some common, but is not all about makeup, hair, skincare, etc. So, you know, when it comes to that intersection between corporate comms, talent, HR, and trying to communicate who we are as a company, you know, we have to break down barriers and sort of demystify constantly, because we have such strong consumer brands in the market. We have Urban Decay, we have L'Oreal Paris, Garnier, Kiehl's, Lancome. So these are very well-known brands. So how to break through for a candidate who is also a consumer, how do we break through and show them that, yes, you may be familiar with one of our brands, but there is a place here for you, whether or not you've ever used any of our products or brands in the past. And that's really where that employer branding comes into play. So when it comes to working with our brands, sometimes we do work with our brands. For example, pre-COVID, we had a brand activation on the Howard University campus where we partnered with Dark and Lovely, which was one of the brands that we own, and we did a social media activation during Black History Month on campus. So that was where employer branding and Dark and Lovely really had a unified mission, a one voice to come and share something of ourselves and allow other voices to, from this university environment to activate. And then sometimes, we're going to have, separate but parallel missions. For example, in the L'Oreal Paris, I don't know if you saw, put out a statement about a former influencer that we parted ways with, and we reconciled and re-listened and acknowledged, right? So in that moment, we let the brand speak. So, we let L'Oreal Paris speak, share, with Monroe, share that her voice, and let that voice be the star versus having a separate statement on behalf of the group, on behalf of employer branding, et cetera. So it is a very fine line to walk and, try to figure out how you really navigate that.
Yeah.
But I think that's the fun of the job, and for those of us in this, I guess, emerging profession, how employer branding manifests is very different depending on the company you're working for, depending on the industry that you're in. So, be happy to speak to any and all of those things.
Latoya, there was a question in the chat around the Juneteenth piece you mentioned.
Yes.
And the question was around how you felt or may feel as a person of color writing about topics that relate to your experience. And I know as a queer individual myself, I've been asked at times to share stories and experiences. And sometimes I've been willing and wanting to do that. And sometimes it's been a little invasive. So how was that experience for you? Was it something you wanted to do? Was it something that was asked of you? And what would be your advice to people that are getting asked similar questions and having to, even if it is indirectly or directly, address some of the topics that impact them directly?
Yeah, I actually raised my hand. I don't know if you guys can tell my personality already from this, but I raised my hand to do it. The article is more about things you could do on the day. And I'm on the communications team, so it was open to anyone. And I said, I have some suggestions. I would like this to be a moment of education. And that's something that I raised my hand for. I think that's important. I think sometimes, and you hit the nail on the head, sometimes you don't feel like you're in the space to educate. And I think that's okay to say that. So I think anyone that is, had that experience, sometimes you're not there yet. But for me, I wanted to make sure that they had kind of the right set of things to do on that day, that they knew the history of the day. For me specifically, I went to an HBCU, so that's a historically Black college and university. So there's a lot of education that I had just around what Juneteenth is, that some people may not have had before that day. So I wanted to make sure that I imparted that wisdom to my organization as well. And that's pretty much how I approached it. It was more like, these are the things that you can do. This is the history of the day. Share your story. So like I mentioned, we really asked our employees, we gave them the mic. If you want to share what you're doing that day, we invited them to do that as well.
Absolutely. Stephanie, we had another question in the audience. One was around kind of, as unemployment numbers have risen, there's a lot of people on the job market. But some of the companies, particularly Mary's company, might not be the sexiest company or might not be as well known as a Mastercard or L'Oreal. So curious what you would say or what advice you would provide to maybe a smaller company or a less sexy company that could kind of drive people to want to apply there and want to engage. What would be your advice on the employer branding side there?
Sure. Yeah. So I think again, yeah. So I'm in the tech space, and again, definitely not, L'Oreal, if you will. But I think it's about being intentional, and I think it's understanding that for even the small companies, you might not have the monster budgets to go do, like an activation, but there are small things that you can do that really have an impact, right? So it's really understanding kind of where your key hiring markets, what's the key demographics that you're looking for, and where do these talent play? If you're looking for developers, could you do a partnership? If you're trying to hire in a specific city, could you do some sort of a targeted event? But I think particularly with the job market being what it is right now, there's definitely a lot of folks that are looking. But I think if you're clear about, first of all, your company and what people get out of working there, and really kind of your focus areas, you can really, a lot of employer branding professionals, you have to do a lot with a lean budget. And so I think being clear about your priorities, I think is a great way just to get started.
Absolutely. Kathy, obviously diversity, equity, and inclusion are top of mind right now for many professionals, particularly those that work in HR, comms, or marketing. One of the things that doesn't get mentioned often in DEI, and even didn't get mentioned in my DEI session I just had over an hour ago, is disabilities, and our employees with disabilities, particularly those that those kind of minorities or those of certain perspectives that are invisible, that might not be visible to the human eye, and if not raised, people might not mention them. I'm curious how you approach ensuring that people that come to your site that maybe have a disability or maybe aren't able-bodied understand that they're accepted and wanted and encouraged to apply for your roles, and how COVID might play into that, because I've actually seen a lot of HR professionals share that COVID has allowed the opportunity for disabled persons to actually take on more jobs because they can do it in the safety of their own home with their own setup and can ask a little bit more for their own supplies. So curious to hear how you as an employer branding professional approach making sure that all diversity is showcased in your employer branding, but specifically maybe some of those invisible diversities, for lack of a better term, like disability.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think very, very timely in this discussion of diversity and inclusion. So, I mean, it starts with your company culture first of all, and how you and are you being explicit on how you define diversity, right? Diversity in all its dimensions. Do your employees, first of all, understand what diversity and belonging means, and what are all these points of intersectionality, all of the dimensions, including, mental health, mental wellness, health and well-being, and, dimensions of disabilities. So I think, the health and wellness and sort of the invisible dimensions of diversity have really actually come out because people, in this sort of Zoom culture now are actually feeling more comfortable almost coming out, and sharing more of those stories. One of our, we call it a diversity inclusion team, but one of our D&I professionals, he was born, mostly deaf and has, hearing aids, in order to hear. And it's something that he has spoken out a lot about, because the working from home has completely changed his approach to work. So, first of all, it starts with, your definitions. Are these core? Do people understand them? Then really looking at the voices that are rising, that are coming out, that want to speak out. And again, with employer branding, I think, sometimes we feel like, putting, quotes or, people's photos and pictures, that's not actually what it's about. What it's about is allowing space for employees to speak out and then amplifying when needed, right? That is something that we can do as employer branding professionals to amplify. And so what we've been doing is amplifying internally these voices, like I mentioned, my D&I colleague, and helping them figure out how to amplify externally on LinkedIn, on our site, etc. So, while we've been doing that for a while, I think COVID shifted the way we thought about it, who decided to speak up. and creating almost a new set of ambassadors who are very excited to share their stories and their struggles and challenges with dealing with a disability or dealing with a family member with a disability during this crisis. COVID, I think, has particularly brought on a lot of self-reflection, even before the current movement that we're in, right? We were all in this moment of self-reflection, and our identities are a part of that. And choosing to speak up, is not something that everybody will make that choice, but for those who do, we're excited to help with that. So
absolutely, Latoya. One of the things I'm thinking about is obviously there still is a lot of work to do when it comes to creating diverse workplaces. Black Americans, for example, make up roughly 15% of the population, but roughly 2% in tech, for example. And so there obviously is a lot of work to do to continue to hire and recruit and maintain diverse talent within your organization. And so I've heard a lot in the HR space and in the comm space and in the marketing space over the last few weeks since George Floyd's murder around the need to increase diverse attention to your job board to make sure that you're showcasing your inclusion. And I often hear excuses as it relates to, we don't have diversity. So how do we showcase that we're wanting diversity if we maybe don't have it? And, I think to Kathy's point about the images of it starts to get a little clip art kind of run and play random images of diverse talent so that you're kind of hitting every market on the employer page. And so curious to hear from you for brands that are trying to say, we know we have to do better. We're trying to increase diversity within our organization. These are the things we need to work on. What would be your advice to them from an employer branding perspective on how to showcase that in an employer branding story? I think you might be muted, or I can't hear you. No worries.
Right.
There you go.
Teach us that, Paul.
Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think just saying it plainly, because some of that I've experienced in that I'm working with a global team. And I think many of us in employer brand are centrally located in our HQ. So that's where I am. So when we look at diversity, right, in the US versus outside the US, then we're looking at, people of color in the US, we're looking at women outside the US, and it's not a one size fits all as far as inclusion across the board. So I think if you're an organization that doesn't have diversity, I think you have to say that. I think you have to show that this is what we're looking for our teams. I've seen a lot of companies do innovative things. I think it was yesterday on LinkedIn, I saw someone that said, we're looking for a CEO. We'd like our CEO to be someone of color. These are the things that we're looking for. And it was literally a checklist of the experience of, these are the academic requirements that we're looking for. These are the industries that we're looking for. And to me, it was so powerful because it wasn't an interesting, engaging video. It wasn't that kind of clip art approach that you're talking about. It's really like we want change, we need change, and these are the things that we're looking for. And I think to have that authenticity in your approach is really, I think all of us can say the Holy Grail. That's what we're looking for. You want an emotional connection in anything that you're creating. So if you're saying we want to do better, we didn't realize we were doing this, or, unconscious bias is a real thing, this is what we want. Now, once you are starting to bring people into your organization, I think it's important not to stop and say, great, we checked that box, right? So you want to continue, use those people, right? Use those folks as your ambassadors to continue to bring other like-minded people from the same experience, from diverse experiences, to continue to grow your organization. But I would say just speak it plainly and, lift the veil a bit. Transparency is so key right now. So that would be my advice.
Yep. Stephanie, marketing is obviously an external campaign or kind of an external focus to really showcase your brand. Employer branding is very similar. It's external, but I think the unique thing about employer branding is that it obviously has to tell the story it has to tell internal stories. And so because of that, I think there probably is a feedback loop that often takes place from your external employer brand to your employees responding about how that employer brand is being demonstrated. And so So Michael Flowers actually asked in the chat, how do you change your brand, or like how do you do a brand change without making cultures or without making disabled persons or etc. left out or overlooked? So how are you kind of ensuring that you're always centering the brand that is representative of your current employer experience while also centering externally who you're trying to attract? Like, how do you keep those two wheels constantly churning?
Sure, no, that's a great question, and thanks for asking. I think again, it boils down to kind of being authentic, and I think you kind of, it's funny you've touched on it in different ways of like, you know, this kind of clip our concept, but you don't want people to feel tokenized, because the truth of the matter is the goal of employer branding isn't to like have one person from every population to showcase that we have diversity. It's more around what's the culture, what's true about working there, what are things that people are proud and happy about. And with everything I work on, I always want to make sure that people are excited to be featured. So for example, when I worked on our Twilio diversity page, you know, we wanted to feature a mix of identities. And so it was really working with the employee resource group to say, hey, you know, this is a project I'm working on. This is what we think about the site, and who wants to kind of raise their hand and get involved. And there were people that, you know, employees that signed up, but there were also groups that said, to be honest, I haven't had a great experience, and I don't feel comfortable being showcased. And being able to kind of, one, respect that, but also think through in terms of diversity, what are some things we could do to, again, move the needle so that group feels included. I think it's not just about featuring people, because we want everyone we feature to be excited. It's one, what's the experience like, and what are moments that we can honestly tell about, like, this is a great part of the culture. What are the things that we've done with our Black employee group? Like last year for Juneteenth, we did a big event, and it was fun, and we took photos, and we were able to showcase that because we enjoyed it, and it was fun, and it was something that everyone enjoyed being a part of. So there weren't any issues with the image being used. But I think once you start to get into this kind of checkbox mentality, then it's like, well, are people having a great experience? And so I think internal always has to match external. I think as we get feedback from groups, and anytime I'm working on, you know, content, it's trying to get that loop of like, what are you thinking? What's not resonating? What doesn't look right? Because I think, again, it's just, we walk that delicate line of like, truth in advertising matters, and you don't ever want to put out a big campaign and it's like, well, actually, I've had a terrible experience. So I think for me, it's being more intentional, moving away from that checkbox, and really, what are those authentic moments that people really enjoyed? And how do you get people excited about, yep, I want to be featured. Once you post it, I'm going to amplify, because that's when you really start to get like great content and conversations on your networks, is when employees are excited to be a part of it, and when they're like genuinely advocating. Like, you don't even have to prompt them. They're so excited. And so for me, I think, again, it all boils down to being authentic.
Absolutely. And I always joke about this in HR, but you know, you can tell one story externally, but Glassdoor is going to tell another, and those two have to align. Like, the people that go to Glassdoor often aren't writing the best review, just like the people on Yelp aren't writing the best review. So you get one story on Glassdoor and you get another one on employer branding, and the closer that they are, the more authentic your story is going to be. Also, love what you said about tokenism, because I think it's so true. People often conflate inclusion with tokenism, and it's a fine line, you know, like as a queer person, I want to be able to participate in what pride is at my company, but I also don't want to only be included in certain conversations as a queer person. So it's a fine line to make sure that you're actually opening up the door, like Latoya did with the Juneteenth article. She wanted to take on that opportunity. It was something she wanted to do. She wasn't utilized as a token by Mastercard to write that article as a Black person. So those are the differences, and it's very important to kind of separate tokenism from inclusion. Inclusion has authenticity and positive intent. Tokenism has negative intent for the appearance of authenticity. Kathy, one of the questions that we had here in the chat is, how do you leverage external and internal sentiment data about employer brand to influence the change regarding the candidate experience and the employee experience?
Yeah, great question. So I think, you know, a lot of the times people who are not familiar with employer branding think, you know, it's all the images and the things that we see on social, on their website, but it's actually rooted in a lot of data. So, you know, when we think about our employer value proposition, which is the foundation for all employer branding, essentially that's a promise. It's a promise we make to our employees, and that promise has to hold true for people entering the organization. So we have to measure that. Are we keeping our promise? Are we, are we validating that, that sort of social contract with our employees? So we regularly survey our internal employees, but then also leverage things like LinkedIn, Glassdoor, comparably other, other ratings and review sites to see where are the similarities, where is the, what are the trends that we're seeing, what are the things that we can improve, and that's really where sort of the human resources side, comes to life, because if we're not meeting our obligations, or if there's areas for improvement, which there always are, they actually become HR initiatives. And then when that becomes a success, then that's something that we can amplify externally. And so the sort of the loop continues, right? So it's this, it's this continuous cycle of feedback, improvement, sharing externally, so that we're constantly looking at those metrics. So just to echo what Stephanie said, the external has to match the internal, but then we need to have that feedback loop open, make sure we're leveraging metrics and seeing how we're trending over time. Are we improving on those points that we set out to? And then can we leverage that and leverage those great stories to share externally?
Yep. Latoya, obviously we can hear a little bit here on the cross functionality of the role, getting marketing buy-in, getting comms buy-in, getting HR buy-in, and kind of being that middle person at times between the three functions, depending on how large your org is as well. Curious how you navigate that. How do you, as your role is kind of in the middle, how do you make sure that you're appeasing marketing from a brand reputation perspective while also making sure that it's something that HR can truly back up? How are you navigating those relationships, and what would be your advice to people in terms of that navigation?
Yeah, well, I think I'm in a unique position because I sat in HR for so long, so I have great relationships. So it makes it a little easier for me, particularly to navigate that. But I would say, they're all your clients. And if you look at it that way, you have to figure out the way to make your clients feel like they have what they need from you, but also ensure that you're keeping the customer, right, happy, which is the customers are the candidates for us. Those are the people that we're trying to reach. So if we look at it and say, okay, fine, we won't tell the story this way, because sometimes marketing and brand says, well, that's not on brand for us, the way that this looks. Okay, I see Stephanie nodding her head. We've all had that conversation. So, brand might say, well, this is not on brand. This doesn't look this way. HR will say, well, that's, do we want to say it like that? We really just want this, and we have to say, well, tone and messaging is important. And HR, I love you guys, but not always the best as far as like creative marketing and messaging. So at the end of the day, you're the expert in the room. You're there for a reason. And you really just have to go forward with confidence and say, listen, I've spoken to this team, This is how we should go forward. I think it's always impactful to bring in outside insights, what other brands are doing, what metrics, what data you've seen, how this has been successful in other places. I love to use Gartner is really great for data and research. Universum is like, the Holy Grail again of employer brands. They have great insights. So when all else fails, when you're trying to make sure you get something to move forward, I would pull those different pieces in, data, relationships. If you don't have those relationships, you need them to be successful in this role. So put that on your to-do list for sure.
Yeah, and if you're ever in need of more marketing data, Notch.
Of course,
hello.
Notch. How did I forget that?
No,
that's what I meant to say.
We can help with all your employer branding needs. We have about 4 minutes left, and I want to do some rapid fire questions. One of them kind of being around the fact that employer branding is a new industry, as you kind of have all alluded to. Some companies don't even have employer branding, and some companies are just now having maybe 1 or 2 people that are responsible for this function. So knowing that a majority of our audience are marketers, comms people, some DEI people, some employer branding people, maybe even people that want to get into employer branding down the road, what would be the one thing that they could change tomorrow on their either their job board or their employer branding experience to improve how people perceive them as an employer. Stephanie, let's start with you. One small change.
One small change, be more human. So one of the first things I did when COVID hit was I changed the way we disposition candidates. So rather than the standard rejection email that we get, I made it more human in terms of like acknowledging this is a tough time. You know, we're still hiring at Twilio, which is great. So I also put that in there and also shared some resources for candidates. And we've gotten a lot of great feedback. And so for a lot of folks, I know it's overwhelming. You're thinking, what's a big campaign I could do? I say back it up. How can you be more human in your comms? Is there a blurb you can put on your website right now in terms of COVID, in terms of what's going on? Start small. Small changes can make big impact. So that would be my number one recommendation.
Latoya, what about you?
Yeah, I think if anyone's considering this profession, I think the biggest thing is, all marketing experience isn't the same. So you really want to work on your analytic skills. Social listening is a big part of what I do. And then really looking at reaching audiences. If you've someone who's worked even in the music industry and you've been able to build a personal brand for an artist, then this may be an industry for you because you're really building a smaller personal brand within a larger brand. So I would say look at that. And then, you're a culture carrier, you're a story maker. So those are the things that you really want to work on. How can you write a story? How do you get people on your side? How do you get buy-in? That's a big part of this also.
Kathy, what about you?
Yeah, and if you're looking to get into this field, be an advocate for the company where you are today. If you are passionate, if you have great experiences there, work with your comms team if they don't have an employer brand function. Figure out how to create ambassadorship in your organization. These are things that actually can be done at the grassroots level, and we have great ambassadors who are amplifying completely on their own through their own social channels, creating their own stories. So if you have a passion for that at your company, just start doing it. Start getting your name out there and amplify the voice of your company through your own channels. I think it's a great exercise, and to see, is this something that you want to do on a regular basis at a large scale, and working multifunctionally across borders and across divisions, in your company. So, and also happy to link with anybody else who's looking for a career in this field. Yeah. More of us.
Yes. One last fire round question, lightning round. I don't know what these are called. The last one would be around specifically Black Lives Matter and the social justice / systemic racism conversation that's going on in the national discourse. How does employer branding, one way they can address that authentically today? Stephanie?
Sure. So like I said, you have to be internal champions within your organization. And I think if your company hasn't already made a statement, you should definitely push for leadership to do that. I think it's important for companies to take a strong stance on issues. And beyond that, be clear about what are the actions that you are taking to build an anti-racist organization. So if your company hasn't done that, as employer brand professionals, I think we can use our influence and just our marketing expertise and comms to kind of help drive that forward. And that was something I was also part of at Twilio as well, in terms of like, how do we communicate that out? And then I think also, I would say another thing is, as you start to think about how your company is educating themselves, what are the employee resources doing to kind of build a better world, it's figuring out how do you authentically tell that story. And again, the goal isn't to be self-promotional, but it's really, there's a lot of interest in educating and learning right now. And if there are resources that you find are working really well at your company and really making an impact, it's working to make sure you're sharing that out because everyone can benefit. And I think we all professionals, it's beyond what you're doing internally, is are there great nuggets that you can share externally, because we all want to build a just society.
Absolutely. Kathy, what about you?
Yeah, it's about embracing the fear, but going out with transparency. We talked about the fact that maybe you're not that great at diversity. Maybe you don't have a lot of Blacks or African Americans in your organization. Own it, share it, Don't be afraid, because that is the first step. And this movement is to recognize that we need to do more, and don't be afraid to share that, right? Every company is at a different stage of where they are with inclusion and belonging in the organization, but own it, share it, and be transparent. That's what we can do, and that's how we're going to move forward to make change, is by owning where we are and providing a way forward. So don't be afraid 100%. Of that, because that is going to be your way, to improvement.
Yeah, that's the North Star. Latoya, what about you?
I feel like Stephanie and Kathy took my answers, but I I guess the one thing I would add to that is, Black professionals are watching, right? So if your company has not said something, I'm not going to tell you it's too late, but I will say that Stephanie said it's too late. But I think I've seen screenshots, and now, LinkedIn even is changing a bit, the tone on LinkedIn, how people are speaking out professionally. So, if you haven't, then you really have made a stance the other way, right? You've said it's not important to us. And so when you're trying to hire that, Black software engineer, most likely they're not going to come to your company, because they're going to look at this moment in time and see what you stood for. It's a time to demonstrate your values, and that should be core to who your company is as a company. If you're talking about yourself as an inclusive employer, that's the moment, because it affects your employees, so it should affect you as a company.
Absolutely. And I said this on the DEI conversation, but this is how I see it. I see it that this is our corporate global warming, kind of awareness right now. In 30 years, in 2050, minorities will become the majority. And so you get it right now, or you're not going to get it right. Brands will not survive this movement, and this is going to only increase over time. So it's really on all of our brands at this time to really tackle diversity, equity, and inclusion authentically, and that comes both in the employer branding and in the DEI space. Time is of the essence. We have about 30 years until that shift starts happening. And if you look at Zoomers, and if you look at Alpha, this rising generation, it is the most diverse and most inclusive generations we've ever seen, and they're going to challenge brands to be reflective of their own experience. Thank you, three ladies, three badass women leading employer branding in the industry. I appreciate you taking the time. And guys, stick around. We will be back shortly with more content. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.